I'm going to invite Brett Ullman to come up. Brett, why don't you come up and join me? I want to get right into asking some of the tough questions surrounding the issue of anxiety and self-harm. Brett, there's so much we could talk about here. It's a huge issue. It's heavy. So many, programs, bands are talking about this issue. And as we discussed, it happens at different levels. There's stress. They're actually in a room like this. There are probably many struggling with stress at different levels. Could be just image. Could be expectations from parents, as I mentioned earlier, or it could actually be at a clinical level. Before we even get into that, you and I have talked, and I'd love for you to just describe something of your own journey through all of this.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, first quick question. How many of you know someone who struggles with eating disorders, suicide, cutting, mental health of any way, shape, and form? Quick show of hands. All right, so we're in the right place for this. Let me give you my journey. So I was a teacher. I was a teacher for a decade in the Melbourne community of Scarborough. I'm actually a trained high school teacher who taught grade 7s and 8s. Left that 10 years ago to do this full time, and as soon as I left teaching, I did a program called the Aero Leadership Program, which is just a multi-year leadership program in BC. Went straight from that into a master's degree down at Wheaton Grad School in Chicago, and now I find myself being an international student, so now I'm having to pay a lot of money to go to school in the US, and so now my speaking dates go from 115 speaking dates a year to 275 speaking dates a year. Now that's just ludicrous, not the musician, the word, right? That's just absolute crazy speaking, 275 speaking dates a year. I once spoke 35 times in 14 days. And in my mind, I'm like, hey, I just paid for my residence, or I can eat food when I go to that chorus, or I can pay for my flight. My friends, my family, my mentors, pastors around me all said the same thing. You can't keep going at this pace. I'm also married with 2 kids. I was involved in sports. I play, I coach, involved in things at church and many other things. And so suddenly, everyone's saying you got to slow down. And I just kept saying March 1st, 2012, March 1st, 2012. Because if I can just make it to March 1st, 2012, that's the day I graduate, and then I can kind of jig my life. And I did. I graduated February 28th, and the next morning was the last day I've slept through the night. And I woke up 2 hours early that day. And over the next 5 months, I call it a pre-breakdown. It's not really a medical term, but it's what I call it. I was at a Pentecostal church in Woodstock speaking, and in a room like this, my knees buckled at the front. It's tough enough when you speak. I speak quickly sometimes and I see snow. This was like my knees buckled, and in my head I'm like, how do you gracefully pass out in front of 500 people? Like, do you just fall to your knees? Do you just fall? Like, I'm a big guy. Do I fall over on someone? And I went home and I was confused and I didn't really know what was going on, and my doctor said, you might have some anxiety. And I'm like, that's funny, I speak on anxiety. And then I was okay, and I went back on tour. I was doing all the Catholic high schools in Windsor. And one morning I found myself crying in my car, and I remember going, I'm not okay. Like, that's not normal. Nothing's happened. I'm just crying in my car one day, and I went home, and then I was fine, and then I was not, and then I was at a camp called Lakeshore out in Coburg, and I was supposed to speak for the week, and I collapsed basically in a McDonald's parking lot, and then didn't leave the cottage for the week, and then didn't work for the next year. Spent a year dealing with panic attacks, anxiety, and depression, and again, it's ironic in that I speak on this for a living. Spent a year at home, and I'm 5.5 years plus past that, and I still have to sit in a chair. I couldn't sit in a chair like that. Pope Francis once said, recovery is making a life despite limitations. And my new limitations are, as a speaker, my anxiety is high. Like, I shake even when I'm in front of an audience, and it's not because of fear. I've been speaking for 20 years. It's just that's how anxiety works with me. And so I have to ask for chairs like this and different things, but it's just interesting. As someone who speaks on it, it's now part of my journey as well.
Brett, for someone who is here who actually is not struggling with it, but as we just saw by a show of hands, there are a lot of people who know someone who's struggling with these issues and wants to help. What would you say to that person?
Well, I use this story, and to my daughter Zoe, who's here, I asked this question, if I can talk about this. So my daughter came home one day, and she was upset. One of her friends was struggling with cutting. This was in grade 8. And she kept saying she needs to fix her. And that's what I hear from students all over the place. It's the idea of, I need to fix my friend. My girlfriend, even I hear students say, my mom or dad struggle. How do I help fix them? And what I said to her is the same thing I'd say to anyone in this room. If your friend, your family, someone is struggling, you're a student. Your job is not to fix them. Your job is to love them. Right? I'm in my 40s. I will help set the place for the people to get the counselors and the parents and the adults and the people around that person, so that if they want some healing, they can walk down that. But as a student, that's not really your role. Your role is to unconditionally love the friends around you as much as you can in that journey they're walking through.
What about the person who actually is struggling in a room like this? Not actually the outsider, but a person who'd say, I am that 15-year-old girl, 15-year-old guy, and I'm really struggling with this. What happens to them today? How do they, today, what advice would you give for them?
It's funny, the older I get and the longer I speak, the more simple I want to make things. And I found myself as a speaker, as a leader, as a parent, suddenly dealing with anxiety and panic. And the things the church offered me were interesting because they were statements that I didn't know what to do with. It was a lot of people who would say, well, have you tried Jesus? And I would say, what do you mean by that? They're like, Jesus. And I'm like, I know Jesus. What do you mean by have you tried Jesus? Like it's a chocolate bar. And I would say, what do you want me to do with that? And they're like, isn't that what I'm supposed to say to you? And I'm like, I don't know. And then they would leave. And people would give me, there was a million things they said and a million people to talk to, and it was just chaos. And so when I was at home, my wife said to me, you might as well consider this a sabbatical, like a forced sabbatical, but it's still a sabbatical. And I like to create, so I began to create a talk I do called The Walking Wounded. And the core of that talk is the answer to, what do you do today at lunch when one of your friends walks up to you and says, my hand's shaking and I don't understand? Or last night I had some suicidal thoughts, or my girlfriend is really struggling and I don't know what to do. And I think what we need to do is to look at this as a process, because we don't know if it is a physical issue going on, if it's an emotional, psychological issue going on, or if it's a spiritual issue going on. So I would say simultaneously deal with this from 3 different perspectives. So the first is body. Go to a family doctor and say, I'm struggling, and get blood work done and find out, is there anything wrong with your thyroid glands? Do you have low B12, low vitamin? There's a million things that could be wrong with you physically. So go see a doctor. If you're struggling with anxiety and panic and depression, you're probably not sleeping well. Go to a sleep clinic. Make sure there's nothing wrong with your sleep. And then there's a million other things you can do. I remember once I had a neurologist, because my anxiety manifests as dizziness. So my brain doctor leaned back in his chair once and he said, I wonder if you have a brain tumor. And I kind of looked at him, and he said, oh, did I say that out loud? And I'm like, yeah, you just told the guy with an anxiety disorder, hey man, you might also have a brain tumor. So I slept very little for the next upcoming few weeks until I had my MRI and no brain tumor. But, go through the physical conversations. And I would say this to everyone in the room. You need to sleep more. Stop binge watching Netflix TV shows till 2 a.m. and go to bed, right? They now say that your generation won't grow to your appropriate height because you're not sleeping enough. So sleep more, eat better. I'm not saying everyone go paleo or whatever diet of the day. I'm just saying eat better and exercise daily. And if you have anxiety or depression, it becomes part of your life. I swim or run or bike or do something every day of my life. So look at it from a physical standpoint. While you're doing that, find a counselor. Find a counselor who can give you strategies on how to cope and how to deal with your anxiety, how to look at the things in the mind when you struggle, when your mind starts going down that rabbit hole. How can you walk through that? And people often say, well, counselors are for the weak. And I'm always like, no, counselors are for the strong. I think weak people do nothing. If you want to get better, that's a strength, that's a good thing. And so do those strategies. And then at the same time, and the truth is, Father, Son, and Spirit are over this entire conversation. But prayer and restoration prayer and spiritual disciplines, praying, fasting, studying, serving, you name it, all the spiritual things as well. But I think that's how we kind of attack this. And remember, this is a fight. I think we're very apathetic with mental health. There's a musician that the students won't know, the leaders will. His name's Bruce Cockburn. He once said to kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. And I would say, this is a fight, so fight. If you're not well, Perry Noble, a pastor in the US, once said, it's okay to not be okay. It's just not okay to stay that way. So it's okay that you're not okay. But go to a doctor, go to a counselor, tell someone, walk through that journey, but don't just sit and struggle in that misery. You can walk through that to hope and freedom and peace.
That's really good. We're going to open it up for questions in just a moment here. And by the way, Brett is going to be facilitating a chat room on this later in the morning where you can follow up a conversation with him on this. Before we go to questions here, can you just maybe expand on your own experience? Now, Michelle Tepper is going to be talking about why, how do we deal with, pain and suffering in our life. So I don't want to sort of steal any of her thunder here. But can you explain maybe your own experience of God in this? Where have you seen God in this? And we're open to mess. This is not, can you give us some clean answer? But actually this is honest. We'd love you to say, yeah, this is my experience of God in this. I didn't hear his voice. Or, yeah, this is where I saw God.
They say in mental health in the church, a third of the people who go through deep journeys walk away from Jesus forever. A third, they say it's like they meet Jesus in the clouds. But they don't literally go into the clouds. But, it's the idea of they just meet God. And a third are in the middle. And that's kind of me. I remember once sitting down with my counselor, and this took a long time to say, and I took a big breath, and she's tapping away on her computer, and I said, I don't feel God anymore. And she said, yep, and she kept typing. And I said, sorry, I don't feel God anymore. Did you hear me? And she goes, yep, and she kept typing. And I said, sorry, look at me. Can you look at me, please? I said, I run a national ministry talking to people about, how we connect our faith and our world. I just told you I don't feel God anymore. And you don't, and she goes, listen, you're depressed, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And she said, do you connect with your wife in that feeling way? And I said, no. She said, your kids? No. I said, friends? No. And she said, that's absolutely normal. And she said, you're okay. And it was, I think I cried. It was the first time someone said to me that you're okay in this journey. Because for some of you, it is like God just shimmies up beside you in this moment. You can feel his presence. And for some of us, we often use the term the dark night of the soul. And that's been my journey. It's been a dark, dark thing. But her point was kind of the idea of depression and anxiety are sometimes like a wall between you and God. And we don't suddenly feel God. But here's the problem with that. Just because we don't feel God, none of you say, I have a feeling in God. We say we have a faith in God. But the moment we don't have a feeling, we now then question our faith, which is the definition, literally, of faith. So even though that's been my journey, there are things that I can find that have become good in this, right? It's the working out with God for the good. And that's where I could have never sat here 5 years ago and had this conversation like I can now. I could have spoke with empathy, but I think someone said to me the other month, I can now speak with authority because I'm going through it and living through it. And I would just say, if you want to chat, there's chat rooms and there's questions, but come and bug me today, right? I'll be around the rest of the day. If you want to chat one-on-one, come and find me and we can sit and talk for a few minutes, lunchtime, whatever it might be.
Wow, it's really helpful. Let's just give a hand for Brett. That's really helpful. Matt, do we have time for a question?
Thank you, guys. Actually, thank you so much to everyone again who's using Slido. We do have one question. We have time for one, Brett. Here we go, Brett. Is it a sin to commit suicide? This is a heavy question. I don't know if you can unpack that in 1 minute, but what thoughts can you give to that? And maybe this can lead into time later to talk with you.
So it's been an interesting week. The MC from my wedding took his life last Friday, and Matt, you would know. That's a church, a pastor in Oshawa. And so this question's kind of come up. What's weird for me is I missed the funeral because I was filming an episode of for Huntley Street on 13 Reasons Why, the TV show. Is it a sin to commit suicide? A sin, it's an interesting question. The Bible says don't commit murder. Murdering yourself would be a sin. I think the bigger question would be the conversation of, am I still going to heaven if I commit suicide? I think that's the bigger question than the conversation on sin. And I would say, yes, salvation is not based on this conversation. Salvation is a different conversation than something like this. And there's much more to unpack with that. But the simple question is it a sin? I'd say, yeah, like many other things are a sin. But we have a loving and a forgiving God. And I don't think sin like this, in this conversation, would separate us from God through eternity.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett.